Propaganda is a Jewish specialty, and it is no coincidence that Jews become so influential in all the media, have become, rather, so influential in all the media. In their hands, the concepts of tolerance and human rights have become incredibly efficient weapons of white guilt and accusation against the majority culture. In fact, it is not through Jewish-sounding names or a Jewish physical appearance that we can best recognize Jews, but rather from what they write and say wherever they are on earth. Selective amnesia and fabulation. Many Jews, as we know, played an absolutely huge role in the Soviet tragedy from 1917 to 1991, and the 30 million deaths that marked this era. Let us remember that Karl Marx was born into a Jewish family, and that Lenin himself had a Jewish maternal grandfather, that Leon Trotsky, the Bolshevik founder and head of the Red Army, was born a Brunstein, while Kamenev, real name Rosenfeld, and Zinoviev, real name Apfelbaum, were running the two Bolshevik-conquered capitals of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the list of Jews who stood out in the mega-crimes of communism is endless. It must be said, and it must be repeated. Jewish officials and Jewish torturers bore a very heavy responsibility in this tragedy. The perfect world they concocted, and which was supposedly historically inevitable, turned out from the very beginning to be a nightmare for the Russian population. It was not until 1948 when the Jewish intellectual elite began distancing itself from the Stalinist government, and this was only because Stalin had launched his, quote, anti-Zionist campaign, meant to purge pro-Israel Jews from senior leadership positions. This indisputable Jewish guilt for the gigantic crimes of Bolshevism is now systematically being shoved down the memory hole, a phrase from George Orwell's 1984. In Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 2002 book, 2 Centuries Together, the Nobel laureate and 11-year veteran of the Bolshevik Gulag expresses outrage that Jewish intellectuals were still refusing to recognize their ethnic responsibility in the slaughter of millions of Christians. Solzhenitsyn also denounces modern Jews who pose as victims of a, quote, anti-Semitic Bolshevik government, when that government was in fact heavily Jewish, and Jews were among the worst perpetrators. This selective amnesia, is necessary for a people who ceaselessly proclaim their quote-unquote innocence of any provocative acts, as we regularly note in their writings. For example, in an editorial in Israel magazine of April 2003, which says, quote, the first Israeli monthly magazine in the French language, written under the name of a certain André Darman. He wrote, quote, to kill a Jew or a child makes God cry, for we are exterminating, in the Jew, the bearer of universal ethics and innocence. No less. With this mindset of absolute innocence, Jews cannot conceive bearing any responsibility for their atrocities. Jews are only victims, only quote-unquote scapegoats in an evil and hostile world. But very soon the Messiah will punish the wicked, and will restore the victimized sons of Israel to their full rights. Nevertheless, in this same Israel magazine editorial, a certain Friedrich Strausse asserted that the Nazi government was worse than the Stalin regime. He quoted the cruelties he claimed were perpetrated by certain SS men. For example, we learn from Strausse that the Latvian SS man Kukur's hobby was to toss Jewish babies in the air and shoot them in the head as in skeet shooting. He also writes of other episodes, such as the rape of children by the SS before they killed them. The Second World War has certainly stimulated the fertile imagination of the children of Israel. Or perhaps this imagination is once again a case of the Jew's own, quote, projection syndrome. That is, accusing others systematically of one's very own crimes as a matter of consistent PR policy. Always attack. We know, in fact, even if the media never speak about it, that many Jews and their rabbis are involved in the felony crime of pedophilia. See Psychoanalysis of Judaism 2007. And murdering a child would seem to be more a Jewish specialty than a characteristic of the SS mind. The revelations of tenured Professor Ariel Toaf of Bar Ilan University in Israel the son of the former Grand Rabbi of Rome, and buttressed in February 2007 by his 147-page, heavily footnoted scholarly work Pasqua di Sangue, or Blood Passover, reveals proof of ritual murder among some Ashkenazi Jews, that is, Jews of Eastern European origin. Emotional fragility. We outsiders are thus supposed to understand that the sufferings of the Jews cannot be compared to those of any others. As a consequence, we are supposed to get as indignant as they do when a serious historian such as Stephanie Courtois states in the preface of his famous Black Book of Communism, quote, "The death of a Ukrainian child of Kulak origin, that is, one from the independent farmer class, who is deliberately forced to starve to death by the Stalinist government, is as significant as the death of a Jewish child in the Warsaw Ghetto." These simple words were enough to provoke the ire of Frederick Strausse, who declares he was, quote, "stunned by such an affront." Such a remark, according to him, was despicable and represented a vulgar attack against Israel. Quote, "What does this comparison have to do here?" he writes. "Why do we have to use the slaughter of a Jewish child to transmit this underlying false and hateful rumor that the Jews overshadow all other victims of totalitarianism and monopolize all the attention on themselves?" The author of the article, as we can notice, reacts in an outraged and totally disproportionate way to the modest and certainly justified intentions of the level-headed historian Stéphane Courtois. Strausse demonstrates here the, quote, "great intolerance to the frustration," which are so characteristic of the Jewish intellectual. Such reactions are clearly not normal. We wrote that Israel Magazine is a monthly magazine designed for the Jewish community, and that consequently one can hardly accuse Frederick Strausse of lying to Goyish readers, or hiding from the Golem the true nature of Bolshevism and the supposedly malefic cruelty of the SS. Hiding from the Goyim, rather, the true nature of Bolshevism and the supposedly malefic cruelty of the SS. His discourse here does not correspond to any false dialectic, as anti-Semites claim, but here, in this magazine by and for Jews, he is reflecting as a Jew among Jews, writing to Jews in the very essence of their soul. Number one, we are always innocent, and number two, Jewish lives are more valuable than those of others. There is an attack on anti-Semitism, or rather an attack anti-Semitism, that stems from a failure to understand the Jewish identity, and only sees deliberate perfidy where there is, in reality, a genuine existential anxiety, one generated by a deep psychological dysfunction. Hysterical people. The Jews have never dared to collectively approach the mirror on their inner lives, represented by Freudian psychoanalysis, a prism through which the Jews claim to see all humanity, but which, at a closer analysis, sheds far more light on the specific neuroses of Judaism. Psychoanalysis, like Marxism, is a, quote, Jewish science and the product of the Jewish mind. It was therefore logical to wonder how this Freudian discovery corresponds to Jewish specificities. The answer was not initially obvious to the author, and it took the reading and analysis of hundreds of books of all kinds, mostly written by Jews themselves, for him to realize that the searing question of incest stands at the throbbing heart of the Jewish question, and not theoretically either. Jewish mothers do love their sons, as is well known, but outright incest is at the origin of a well-known mental illness, one that especially afflicts Jews, called hysteria. Incest attracted early the attentions of Freud while he was developing his theories. The parallels between Judaism and historical pathology are quite natural. Hysterical pathology, rather. Jewry is well known for these syndromes. He begins, quote, hysteria, depression, introspection, amnesia, manipulation, pathological lying, ambivalent identity, prophetic deception, sexual ambiguity, and so on. Every Jewish symptom is found in hysteria. Freud, as a loyal Jew, merely projected the traits of a specific community onto the rest of mankind. In reality, there is no Oedipus complex, but rather an Israel complex. all Jews together technically being Israel, not just the Near Eastern state. In fact, Jews do not seem to really wish to discuss the topic of incest within their families. On the other hand, all the psychiatrists mention, quote, the hysterical woman, so much wants a child from her father or her doctor that she can persuade herself that she is pregnant by one of them, and thus develops a, quote, nervous or hysterical pregnancy. It is interesting that all Jewish writers use the same term to refer to the coming of their Messiah, namely, the delivery of the Messiah. The whole Jewish community, we must understand, is, quote, the wife of God, the Shekinah of the Kabbalist, who is someday supposed to give birth to the Messiah, and thus the whole of Jewry is indeed suffering from a nervous pregnancy, not unlike that found in nervous, hysterical women. Karl Kraus, the Austrian Jewish journalist who did not agree with Freud, wrote sarcastically, quote, psychoanalysis is the mental illness of which it claims to be the cure. But the right and the best formula can be stated in 10 words. Judaism is the disease that psychoanalysis is meant to cure. The sexual revolution. After Freud, other Jewish thinkers came along who produced a symbiosis between Freudian doctrine and Marxism. Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse preached sexual revolution in order to break down the patriarchal family and unleash, quote, free sex. Their theories largely inspired the student riots of May 68. The 1970s saw a new wave of Freudo-Marxism, and Jewish women were in the forefront, such as Giselle Halimi and Elizabeth Badinter in France, and Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem in the USA. As time passed, a series of Jewish-inspired laws appeared, one after the other, designed to dissolve the family. In France, a New Earth-promoted law legalized the contraceptive pill, 1967. Then came the challenge to the authority of the father as the head of the household, 1970. Then divorce by mutual consent, 1974, and the, quote, right to abortion, promoted by so-called Holocaust survivor Simone Weil, 1975. A great wave of movie porn accompanied this liberation from traditional family values. Here, we are compelled to note that Jewish producers and film directors play a very important role in the sex film industry. See my The Jewish Mafia, 400 pages, 2008. Parallel to this, the Freudian concept of bisexuality favored the acceptance of overt gay pride and homosexuality. A war machine against humanity. In fact, the only tangible results of this moral, quote, liberation was the systematic demoralization and criminalization of the white man, who is denounced tirelessly in movies, literature, and history as the cause of all the planet's ills and of the collapse of the West. The appeal of egalitarianism, as intended by Jewry, tends to level all ethnic differences and identities, and brings their slow destruction. Yitzhak Atiyah, director of foreign language seminars at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Institute in Tel Aviv, wrote this himself in the same issue of Israel magazine, quote, even if reason tells us, even shouts with all its force, the very absurdity of this confrontation between the small and insignificant people of Israel, i.e. all Jewry worldwide, not just the state of Israel, in quotes, and the rest of humanity, as absurd, as incoherent, and as monstrous as it may seem, we are engaged in close combat between Israel and the nations, and it can only be genocidal and total because it is about ours and their identities.